Hello again. In this module, we will continue to talk about making representations in the brain. We'll talk about recognizing objects. So there are two distinct steps in object recognition. Obviously, the first is form perception. We've talked about this before. We have to detect and pull out basic features, color, orientation, size, and maybe even shapes. So some sort of form perception has to be the first step of recognizing an object. And we also know that the feature detection is the first step in form perception. So an object actually gets broken down into its component features, and different cells, different neurons process different aspects of those features, orientation, color, and so on. It seems then that we then have to integrate all of those features back and build up the object. And we know that perceptual grouping principles play a significant role in that. How about after that? Once you see a shape, how do you know if it is a stimulus you've already seen before? If it's a shape you've already seen before, how do you recognize a particular object that is familiar to you? How do you call a rose a rose? So categorization and matching is an important step in the process of object recognition, obviously. So once again, the first step is grouping the features together. Gestalt psychologists gave us good principles or rules by which we can resolve ambiguities in our environment. So for example, if there's a cluster of dots like over here, we might perceive this as 3 groups. Going from here to recognizing objects is a significant step, and many object recognition models have been proposed to describe how behavior results, how behavioral recognition results from form perception. Some of these models are viewpoint independent and some are more viewpoint dependent. What do I mean by that? I mean, does the point of view from which we are looking at the object affect how we recognize it? And I'll give you some examples to show that in many cases it does. So we now turn to this most intriguing and one of the more debated topics in visual perception, which is the identification of patterns and objects. As you'll see, recognizing patterns and objects does not occur instantly, although it does happen rather automatically and spontaneously. Many models have been proposed about object recognition. These models differ on many aspects, particularly on whether object recognition depends on a viewpoint or not. In the recognition by components model, for example, we see a viewpoint-independent recognition. And this model proposes that as long as we can perceive the geometric icons of a particular object, we should be able to recognize it, regardless of viewpoint. Other proposals are much more viewpoint-dependent and require remembered representations to be rotated into alignment with the current view to be able to recognize that object appropriately. We will also see that almost all of these models rely on some aspect or some interaction between bottom-up and top-down processing, by which I mean that both stimulus-driven and experience-driven factors affect recognition. So let's talk about some of these models and see some of the commonalities and differences in the approaches of understanding or describing object recognition. David Marr's model is a structural description model. What he said was that our recognition of 3D objects is based on volumetric features that can be combined to give a particular shape. And he said that the sequence begins with identifying edges and proceeds to recognition of an object, which is very similar to the idea of integrating features that we were talking about earlier. So when an object's image falls on the retina, we first derive contours and identify edges and primitive features like color and contrast and brightness. And then those are grouped progressively into some form of a sketch. David Moore's idea was that over multiple experiences with the same stimulus, we tend to build not just a 2D sketch, but a slightly enhanced volumetric sketch, which is kind of like 2.5D. So we see a little more around the edges. Once we start looking at that object from different viewpoints, those 2.5D sketches can be combined to form a good 3D representation and allows us to recognize that object in future experiences. Biedemann's recognition by components theory is very, very similar. He also described volumetric features as the necessary component of object recognition. However, what he proposed was a set of about 36 geometric icons that he called geons. And he said that these can be combined to make pretty much all 3D objects in our environment. And just by recognizing the combination of geons, which include cylinders and rectangular solids and pyramids, and here are some examples in the picture, you can see that most objects can be described or can be remembered as combinations of these geons. So his idea was that these 36 geons can then lead to description of all objects and therefore recognition. And his idea was that when we recognize the geons of an object, we are able to recognize the object. And if the geons are masked, like in this example, then subjects are unable to recognize those objects. And in ink blot experiments, this has been shown to be true. Occluding the geons of an object tends to render it unrecognizable. You might find yourself having trouble recognizing what this might be because some of the more critical geometric attributes or geons have been occluded. On the other hand, on this side, you might have less trouble calling it a flashlight. And when you go back from the right to the left, you can see how this is actually the same object but covered or occluded differently. So there is some evidence from behavioral studies that show that recognizing these geons is an important component of object recognition. And in modeling brain systems for object recognition, feature nets have been proposed that underlie our perception of objects. And those feature nets can, in fact, behave in exactly the way that people do and show the same kind of recognition deficits if geons are occluded. One piece of evidence supporting the representation of geons comes from studies that have used perceptually degraded pictures or stimuli. And it's been shown that when these kinds of pictures or stimuli are shown to subjects, they are in fact better recognized when the geons are preserved, as opposed to cases in which the geons are not preserved. So if you look at this picture on the right and look at the objects in column A, you can see that these can be degraded by taking away parts of that stimulus. In fact, stimuli in column B and column C were generated by degrading the stimulus in column A to the same extent. But what they differ in is in terms of what is maintained and what is missing. And you can see that if you take away some of the critical geons, then recognition becomes much more difficult, and people are consistently more likely to recognize correctly these images in column B than the images in column C. Once again, then, what you're seeing is an example of how bottom-up processing of these degraded stimuli is affected or influenced by recognition of geons. And you can see that hierarchically, you might be able to build a scissor out of either of these images, but the system or humans do it much better with a stimulus like this than with a stimulus like this. Other models, image description models, for example, have talked about how 3D representations might be built over time or over different experiences. And the idea is that our ability to identify 3D objects comes from stored 2D viewpoints from different perspectives. So every time we are exposed to a particular stimulus, something like this interestingly is an opened up paperclip. And a lot of us have this habit of opening up paper clips. Well, one experimenter decided that this was a very unique stimulus and he could train his monkeys to recognize paper clips from different viewpoints. And this is, in fact, that data. And the monkeys were always had one training view, which is this one, and they respond really well. Recognition performance is best to that training view. But you can see that other viewpoints which are close by are also easily recognized or more easily recognized than viewpoints that are really far away. And we know that view invariance tends to occur only for familiar objects. If it's a novel object, then view invariance does not occur, and showing the object from an entirely different perspective, it's difficult to match it as the same object. So this shows that an observer needs to have the experience of encoding different viewpoints before they can recognize the same object from different viewpoints and show view invariance. But the good, interesting part of this is that our system can, in fact, do this, and we are, in fact, able to build 3D representations from the 2D inputs on our retina. So you might think then that in understanding hierarchical integration of bottom-up inputs and understanding the influences of some top-down effects on these explains all types of object recognition, and it does by a large part. However, there's one type of recognition that seems to demand a slightly different approach, the recognition of faces. There is some evidence that suggests that certain categories of objects, like faces, are perceived using rather specialized mechanisms. These specialized mechanisms go a little beyond the basic bottom-up, top-down effects. As you will see, faces are in fact perceived much more holistically than most other stimuli. Now recognize that people are face experts. We are very, very good at not just seeing, identifying, and recognizing a face. We are also very, very astute at looking at slight disturbances in the expressions or the arrangement of features on that face, and can sometimes read a whole emotional aspect to it or make more categorical judgments about that face. There's also evidence from special types of agnosias that are related to face processing. One's called prosopagnosia, the inability to recognize a face as a familiar face. Having a specific agnosia for face recognition then might tell you that we're looking to see a specialized processor, which when lesioned can cause this episode. So in terms of clinical neuropsychological evidence, having an agnosia of just for faces does mean that there must be a specialized face processing mechanism. Let's go see what that is. In an experiment, Frank Tong and his colleagues used binocular rivalry to show people pictures of houses and faces. So as you can see from the figure on the right, they had superimposed pictures of houses and faces in different colors, and subjects viewed these images also through different color filters on their eyes. So basically, the left eye is seeing the green image and the right eye is seeing the red image. And because images are superimposed and shown at the same time, what we end up with is a rivalry between information from the two eyes called binocular rivalry. Participants were asked to push buttons to indicate what it is that they were perceiving at any given point of time. And very typically, participants reported percept switching between houses and faces. Now, they couldn't see both at the same time. This is very interesting. What they were looking at is either one or the other, and it tended to alternate back and forth between the two forms ever so often. The participants did report that they could focus on one or the other voluntarily, but it also switched between the houses and the faces. While the participants did this task, their brains were scanned in a functional magnetic resonance image scanner, and it was shown that the activity in different parts of the brain correlated with the developing of these perceptual decisions. In particular, the areas here shown in the inferotemporal cortex, called the fusiform face area, in particular, the area deep in the inferotemporal cortex, marked here in green, called the fusiform face area, showed highest activation correlated with the perception of faces, while the parahippocampal areas, these red areas, showed a concomitant increase in activation with the participants' reports of seeing houses. So what we are looking at then is two specialized modules within the inferotemporal cortex for processing or perception of faces and places. There's a lot of other evidence which shows that face perception is specialized. For example, perception and memory of faces is very viewpoint dependent, much more so than other objects. In another study, when images of faces and houses were inverted, performance on the face recognition task was affected much more than on the house recognition task. So inverted faces are much harder to recognize. This high point just means larger number of errors in the case of inverted faces than in the case of inverted houses. Let me give you a taste of what I'm talking about. Look at this image. These are two inverted faces. You may or may not recognize this as Margaret Thatcher, an ex-Prime Minister of England. When you look at these two faces, you see that her inverted image looks fairly normal, both on the left or the right. Now, I'm going to turn these images upright. Let's see what you think of it. So you see what's happening here is the face is upright, but all of the features now are inverted. I don't know if you noticed the first time around that the features were not inverted, even though the face was inverted. But one thing you do notice is that it looks much more grotesque when the features are inverted than when the face is inverted. One more time. Clearly then, inversion of the whole face interferes with the perception of the individual components. Here you are looking at the whole face much more holistically and not paying as much attention to individual features. As long as they are oriented correctly, the face looks pretty normal. So it seems then that the brain has these specialized modules that can process face stimuli much more holistically. And there's some evidence that shows that the same thing happens for other stimuli that we develop a lot of expertise in. And configurations of component parts are more important than individual parts or features. There's been a lot of work on the fusiform face area and face perception that has led to our understanding of the neural mechanisms of holistic processing. FFA activation is usually much more correlated with correct recognition or identification of a face. So in this experiment, there were different face stimuli that were then very quickly masked. So there was a brief exposure, and then the observers were asked to indicate if there was a face or nothing, or another object, or which face it was that they were looking at. And pretty much all famous faces were used in this. On the right here, you can then see the result. The activation is highest when a correct face is identified. It's modulated when the observer saw a face, but the identification is incorrect, and lowest when there is no face detected in the stimulus. So the neural processing associated with both the presentation of a particular stimulus and with the particular response can be read out from these activations. Turns out that many parts of the brain care a lot about how faces are perceived, and all of these modules are likely working together every time we are looking at a face. So the fusiform face area in the inferotemporal cortex on the underside and more medial, somewhere back there, is the module that responds most strongly to faces. The amygdala which is an area in the limbic system, is activated by emotional aspects of faces or face stimuli. The superior temporal sulcus, there's an area right there that responds to where a person is looking and to mouth movements, so analyzing spatial aspects of face stimuli. And then obviously the frontal cortex is very important also and is activated and often correlated with evaluation of facial attractiveness or making other decisions about face stimuli that a subject is looking at. So coming back to our perceptual brain, we see that we have these really specialized modules upstream of all the form processing that actively contribute to object recognition. So these and other single unit recording studies from non-human primates have led to our understanding of how the brain codes for information. And the sensory code is really interesting, and it's been shown that the inferotemporal cortex shows overlap of activation caused by many different stimuli. And although there is specific response within modules, there is also activation across module for the same stimulus for specific stimuli. So coding can be distributed across many brain areas. While a lot of coding is hierarchical, going from features to more complex forms or aspects of that object, we also see ensemble coding. And the idea here is that populations of neurons together code for different attributes or different aspects of the stimulus. And this entire population together then codes for this one person or this one image. And then going from one sense to another, obviously there's a lot of cross-modal integration as well. And we can see that many stimuli require inputs from multiple senses before a correct recognition can be made. And this sculpture is a great example of just such a stimulus. Looking at it, you might think that it's made of driftwood, but if you were also to touch it or tap on it, you would know that it is made of bronze. So there has to be cross-modality in object recognition that goes beyond visual processing. Affecting the activity of any brain part that is associated with perceiving and recognizing objects then can lead to deficits in recognition. We've already talked about some agnosias, the inability to recognize form or shape of certain objects or faces, like prosopagnosia. And in addition to that, there is evidence from neglect syndrome caused by damage to the right parietal lobe. These individuals cannot attend to the left side of space and show recognition deficits on that side of space. And this is good evidence for a lot of crosstalk between the dorsal and the ventral streams. Other individuals have a disorder called integrative agnosia, which is caused again by parietal cortex damage. And this involves preserved ability to detect certain features, but then the ability to combine them into complex forms and objects is disrupted. So very frequently you will see misrecognition of these objects. For example, a harmonica may be labeled as a cash register or a stereo or a computer or a keyboard. And when you just focus on the features, you can see how that misrecognition might be coming due to lack of integration. A similar dissociation can be produced using transcranial magnetic stimulation. TMS is a technique in which a current is passed through a coil, which is placed on top of the scalp, and that current induces a magnetic field that affects neurons that are very close to the scalp. And this magnetic field disrupts the electrical activity of these neurons. So disrupting parietal lobe activity can lead to integrative agnosia or symptoms like integrative agnosia in subjects in an experimental condition as well. In summary then, our sensory systems are set up to make representations in the brain. And every input we take in, be it visual or auditory or tactile, we are in fact ending up with representations in the brain that can influence future perception, but also be used by our memory systems to then guide future action. We'll talk about that in future modules.